Thank you very much for covering this all-important issue, an issue that affects every last person that lives in this city, but strikes at the heart of what New York City police officers do. It strikes at the heart of the promise society makes to New York City police officers, that if you get killed in the line of duty, we will support you, your family, and more importantly, we will keep the evil that killed your husbands off the streets. Standing before you today are the family members who have lost a loved one, a proud, heroic New York City police officer in the line of duty in the service of all of us. These are just a few of the hundreds of families who have made the ultimate sacrifice while protecting each and every one of us, protecting the life that we have, protecting that you can report freely. That's what their husbands did, protect what America's made of. Among this group is Linda Sledge and her son, Richie, and Mary Beth Ruotolo-O'Neill. They both have lost police officer husbands, Police Officer Cecil Frank Sledge and Police Officer Thomas Ruotolo, when confronting armed criminals who had been released on parole. They were out, they committed crimes, the parole board released them, they killed their husbands, they killed our police officers. You should be shocked to hear that Police Officer Ruotolo's killer, George Agosto, was actually on parole for manslaughter conviction, a violent crime, when he shot and killed Tom Ruotolo and wounded two other police officers, Tom's partner and an off-duty police officer who was using a payphone in that gas station. And Police Officer Sledge's killer, a career criminal who was on parole, was a well-known armed robber from that same neighborhood when he murdered Police Officer Cecil Frank Sledge. Police Officer Sledge and Ruotolo would not have died if these career criminals had not been released on parole. If they had gone into prison and stayed in prison and not released on parole, their husbands would be alive today. Revolving door justice killed these two brave and heroic police officers, but more importantly, when that happens, it changed the family. It changed how police officers think. It changed how we do our job. These tragic murders occurred more than 3 decades ago, and today the New York State Parole Board is making that problem worse by opening the jailhouse doors to cop killers. We've made a promise as the public. We made a promise as folks that live in this city. Our elected officials said that we will take care of you. We will make sure you get justice. They have now broken that solemn promise. Not just cop killers, but those who target police officers for assassination. We had one mope already released on parole that viciously murdered Police Officer Piagentini and Jones, set them up, and gunned them down. They set our police officers up for execution in the most cowardly way, and they did it in cold blood. Now these same domestic terrorists, and they are terrorists. When you say terror, what does a terrorist want? To change our way of life, to put fear in your hearts. Well, they are domestic terrorists who've been paroled and are seeking to be released on parole. Under the new parole guidelines, the nature of the crime, regardless of how heinous, barbaric, sadistic, or depraved, is no longer a factor. When you hear the stories of how these heroes were killed, you can't think anything but evil, and how violent the deaths were. The guidelines have been reconfigured so that if a killer admits to the crime and says they're sorry, the jail doors slide open. And what we've found is that they have backing of attorneys and advisors who tell them exactly how to fake it till you make it. Just say it. Just do crocodile tears, and they'll let you out. And unfortunately, they were right, and they have. That is absolutely unacceptable by any standard. So far, 2 cop killers and a killer who machine-gunned down an assistant district attorney to death has been released on parole under these new and unacceptable guidelines. Sal DiCerno, who killed police officer Frank Sledge, is up for parole next month. We must stop it. Black Liberation Army domestic terrorist Anthony Bottom, who assassinated police officer Piagentini Jones, will be up for parole at the end of this year. We cannot allow that to happen. His murdering partner, why are we so concerned? They changed the guidelines. When they changed the guidelines, the doors did swing open. And his murdering partner, Herman Bell, who denied his crime for over 30 years. For 30 years, he said, I'm a political prisoner. I'm not sorry for trying to overthrow your government, and these two police officers got in my way. I assassinated them. I'm not sorry for that. 30 years later, when he had a mouthpiece next to him, when he had a parole board that was fawning over him, he's now on the streets of Brooklyn. So beware. Not just our police officers on patrol. Those police officers on patrol have to watch their back because they've killed once already, and violently. The PBA will continue to fight Bell's release in court, and will continue to fight any time that happens. A parade of cop killers, 59 murderers, 59 cop killers who were convicted after the death penalty was struck down, and parole, life without the possibility of parole for cop killers was adopted, will follow, and their releases must be stopped. There's a loophole that 59 of these mopes fall into, that there was no death penalty. There was no life without parole. If you kill a New York City police officer today and you're convicted, life without the possibility of parole. Unfortunately, these hero families didn't have that option. Their admission of guilt and crocodile tears of remorse will set them free if action isn't taken. And we're calling on every right-thinking citizen to step up and come to action. It may involve your own life. The collective voices of police officer families who lost a loved one in the service of this city are calling for a halt of the release of cop killers, regardless of what decade it happened in. We think back to recent times when our police officers were killed. We had police officers shot and assassinated. And it shocked the city. And we cried, and we prayed, and support came in. Well, it's no different if it happened in 1970, 1980, or any other time. The city was shocked back then. And we made a promise that we will help these families get justice. That promise was broken. It was broken in the governor's office. It was broken in the state legislature. It was broken on the parole board. Shame on them. Shame on them. Where's your humanity that says, look at what they've done. You cannot take that evil away. The PBA continues to support legislation that will take parole policies out of the politicians' hands. That cannot be allowed to happen. We have to have right-thinking people looking at all the criteria. Police officer Cecil Sledge was dragged for blocks. It shocked the police officers, brought us to our knees. You think he's rehabilitated and you release him onto the street? The parole guidelines must be codified in law to prevent these cop killers from happening. When police officer Ruotolo saw a mope who had a stolen moped, saw him gassing up in a gas station, tried to stop him, that mope didn't think twice, lifted his gun, shot Thomas, shot his partner, and shot an off-duty police officer who saw this and tried to intervene. If you'll shoot 3 police officers, you'll kill anyone. So we're here today calling on the governor's office, the state legislature, and more importantly, those of us that walk the streets every day. We're asking you to support the police officers, support these families who have taken the oath of police officers when we say to each other, we'll back you up. They're taking it to a point where they're backing their own families up. Look at the women that are here whose lives have been changed, supporting those that have to go through this and unfortunately have to worry if those that change their lives, those murdering skunks, walk out in the street. At one time, we didn't have to worry about this, but now we do. So we're asking you for your help. Get to the politicians. Demand that they keep their promise. We're asking our fellow police officers. Demand they keep their promise. We're asking our families. Demand that they keep their promise. That's what allows the police officers that go on patrol every day to do their job. It's my honor as a police officer and representing every New York City police officer on this street, it's an honor to introduce to you today a heroine whose life has changed, not by her own choice, but because a mope took her husband away. And all these women had to become mother and father and coach, Girl Scout leader, Boy Scout leader. They had to become the whole world for their families, and that's why they're so strong. So it's my honor to bring up to the podium Linda Sledge, and her son will be standing with her.
It is appalling that a man who was a known dangerous criminal was out on parole when he murdered my husband. Cecil was a wonderful man, a loving father, and a great and proud police officer. It is difficult for me to even imagine how any right-thinking person could consider for a second letting Sal DeSarno back onto our streets, where he will most certainly return to a life of crime and violence. This horrible man denied me and my 2 children of a wonderful husband and loving father. Had he committed this crime today, he would have been given life without parole, which is the only appropriate sentence, absent a death penalty. We no longer hear the words accountability or punishment used regarding murderers in prison. But accountability and punishment is and should always be a part of the sentence. It rips my heart out every 2 years to go to a parole hearing going over my husband's gruesome and brutal murder. No one can understand how this affects my family. I'm asking for the justice that I was promised. I am my husband's voice.
Equally heroic is Mary Beth Ruotolo-O'Neill, who at such a young age became a widow. We should never become a widow or a widower at such a young age and so violently. So it's also my honor on behalf of every New York City police officer to ask Mary Beth to take the podium.
My husband, Tommy, was a funny, bright, and beautiful man. He had a master's degree in social sciences and asked to be assigned to the 401 precinct, Fort Apache, where he could put that education to use for the good of the community. He loved being a cop, and he loved the people in the 401. But in doing so, he encountered career criminal George Augusto, who had stolen a moped. When confronted by Tommy and his partner, Augusto murdered my husband, shot and wounded his partner, and also shot an off-duty officer who was on the scene. This was not his first kill. He murdered my husband while out on parole. This is exactly the kind of revolving door justice that puts criminals onto our streets only to victimize and kill again. It sickens and worries me that the hardest penalty this cop killer could get was 25 years to life with eligibility for parole. We must close this parole loophole that lets cop killers out of prison, because cop killers should never be allowed to walk our streets again.
Thank you, Mary Beth. You know, one of the worries these families had when we were discussing standing before this podium was that they were fearful. It's difficult to stand here. it's difficult to tell the story. But they knew that they were the voice of their husbands and the voice of every one of these women that are back here, because each and every one of them would step to this podium if they had to. And they do it because their husband needs them to. So yes, you're the voice of your husbands. Yes, you're the heart and soul of your husband. Yes, you put a face on your husband when you said what good people that they were. But you're also the face of every New York City police officer. Because we all have police officer families at home that worry the minute you step off the stoop that you're not coming back. They've lived through it. So I thank them for the courage that you show, because we choose to do this job. We choose to go on patrol. But you know what? Our families don't. And they sacrifice more than every last one of us. Our police officers sacrifice, but they sacrifice more. The minute they chose to marry a New York City police officer, they started sacrificing. The sacrifice got worse when they both heard that knock on the door. We are here today to ask every last one of you once again not to take it for granted that the morons on the parole board are going to do the right thing, because they won't. We have to make them do their job. You're their boss. You're the boss. Make them do their job. Go on nycpba.org. Press cop killers, keep cop killers in jail, because it sends a letter to support our families, and that letter follows every one of their mopes. We want to make sure it doesn't follow them onto the streets. Questions?
Pat, you were talking
Yes,
about the 59 cases. So these are all cases where they are eligible for parole?
Yes, ma'am. There's 59 police officers that were killed in the line of duty when there was no viable death penalty and the death penalty was struck down, and before the legislature enacted life without the possibility of parole. So every 2 years, these family members have to go and do a victim's impact statement. What is that? It's where they go before the parole commissioners and tell the story of their husbands, but more importantly, they tell the stories how their lives have been changed since he was so viciously killed. How they're not there for the family functions, how they're not there for the weddings, how they're not there to sit in the pew, in the church, in the mosque, in the synagogue. They're not there with them. They're not there living the American dream. Not by choice, the choice of an animal who decided to kill them. So every 2 years, now, they live through this pain every day. And we can only empathize. Many of us are very fortunate in our lives, and we can only empathize with what they go through. But every 2 years, it gets worse, because they got to live it again. They got to go back to that knock on the door. They got to tear it open for their children. Some of their children didn't even get to know their father, didn't even get to be guided by their father. Some were so young they only hear the stories. If any of you ever lost a family member and the child feels left out because they didn't get to participate in that funny thing Daddy did, think about that. Think about that when you realize in an instant and so violently that the stories they hear about their father involves violence that took them off the streets. How people on the street corners were crying. Think about that, and then press that button. Let's keep these animals behind bars.
Pat,
Yes, ma'am, and I'll come back.
So the governor is appointing members of the parole board. What responsibility does he have for the crime?
He has full responsibility. The governor appointed these folks and put politics before right and wrong. And there is right and wrong in our world. And there's good and evil in this world. He put right and wrong aside and put politics first. That has to stop. It's not too late to change it. We've seen, we all make mistakes. But when we're mature, we recognize our mistakes and we change them. We're calling on the governor, the Senate, the Assembly, and all of us to fix that mistake and make sure one more mope doesn't walk the streets. If they will kill any one of the police officers, what chance do you have when you're walking off to the subway? If they're not afraid of a uniform and a shield and an 8-point cap, they're certainly not afraid of you when you're in your overalls heading off to work. They're not afraid of your briefcase. They're not afraid of you riding the subways. Well, they need to be afraid. They need to say, if you kill a police officer, you will not walk our streets. Yes, sir.
do you believe in redemption?
I do. But we're not talking about a mistake here. We're not talking about a mistake of a young person who stole something when it wasn't violent, and they've seen the error of their ways and they found God and education and all else. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is evil that can't change. Evil where they planned assassinations. Evil where they said, I'm not going back to prison again. I know what it's like. I'm out on parole, and the only thing standing my way is this New York City police officer, so I'm going to kill them. That's what we're talking about. If we don't have a chance, you don't have a chance. So do I believe in redemption? Yes, I do. Do I believe that folks found God? Yes, I do. We've all educated them, and that's a good thing. Let them take that skill, let them take that worship, let them do it all behind bars in prison, and let them teach all the younger mopes that come into prison. Let them teach them, because they've already taught us. They taught us how to mourn. They taught us how to cry. We don't need that lesson again. Let them teach the other mopes. Let them find redemption. Let them do it behind bars when you kill a New York City police officer.
So, Pat, just
Yes,
a
ma'am.
minute. So what changed? I mean, in the past, parole boards have never granted parole to
Yeah.
people who killed police officers. You know, they can have the hearings every couple of years. What changed in that people are now getting released?
The biggest change that happened is where the criteria is not the violence that was put on these police officers, the nature of the crime. The stories we just told, and unfortunately in this group there's all sorts of violence right to September 11th as well. No one hears the story. Those commissioners don't hear that police officers went on patrol that day, left their families behind, saw someone committing a crime and they gunned them down, dragged them for blocks. They don't hear that it killed Officer Ruotolo, then when that wasn't enough, tried to kill another cop. When that wasn't enough, tried to kill another cop. So the parole board is not hearing the nature of the crime. You have to hear the nature of the crime. Because again, we're not talking about someone that robbed a corner bodega and no one got hurt and they were doing it to pay the rent. We're talking about violent crime. Violence against police officers, which is violence against all of us, all of society. It sounds like something we just say, right, violence against society. But it's true. If they'll kill us, they'll kill you. Yes, sir.
Inmate advocates are also frustrated with the parole board. They argue that there's I think only 7 currently that are handling thousands of cases a year. Do you support a sort of a more robust board to sort of examine these cases in a better way?
Right. Well, yes, absolutely. First step we have to do is we have to change the criteria that we look at all aspects, not just what they did in prison. It's easy to be good in prison. You have a correctional officer going to make sure you do what you're supposed to do. You're going to make a correctional officer is going to make sure you get to class and make sure you study, right? So it's easy to do that. The criteria should, number one, be the violence of that crime. And we have to make our parole board do this. It can't be appointed for politics. What we don't need is we don't need advocates on the parole board. We shouldn't have criminals advocates on the parole board. We shouldn't have parole board when you look at their backing, it's all about criminal rights. It should be about society as a whole, violence on the street. So when they make those appointments, let's not go to the Rolodex and pick the advocates that vote for us that may be advocates for criminals. Let's make it advocates for right and wrong. That means getting a regular, average people that can go on there and sit in judgment of the whole case, not just part of the case.
Just to follow up on that, one of the big things they're doing now is kind of teleconferences when you do the parole hearings. Do you think that's also a problem, that they're not seeing people face to face, that they're not getting these
Correct.
kind of meetings?
First off, you have to sit across, as New York City police officers, every person we encounter, good or bad in the day, and as reporters you probably do it too, you read someone, you read their actions, you read if they're sincere or not. If you're not sitting across the table from the mope, you don't know if they're sincere. It's hard to tell across a TV screen. But what's also more important is when the victim impact statements, where the victims, our families, sit across and tell their stories. It's brought police officers to tears to their knees when you just sit and listen to these stories. Because we don't like to think about the bad things that happen. But when these families tell those stories, you can't help but be brought to your knees. That's what they need to see. And that should be the number one criteria. What did this mope do? What was the crime? And every action has a reaction. What was the reaction? Well, the reaction is these ladies that stand behind me today, and their families that changed, and the children that were reared, the children they wanted to have and couldn't because their husband was killed. All those aspects, the plans they had to work, retire, grow old, they didn't get to do any of that. These were young ladies that had to live alone, not by their own choice. So those are the criteria, and yes, you need to sit across from someone and read them and see if they're truthful or not. Good question. Yes, sir.
Do you see this effort as part of a national effort?
It has to be a national effort. New York City police officers are no different than a police officer that's on the West Coast. It's no different than a police officer that's in the middle states. They go out every day to do the job. They do the job for every one of us. So if you're killed here in New York or you're killed someplace else, it should be the same criteria. Unfortunately, some states didn't do what we do. They changed the rules here. They changed the rules midstream for our families here. That's just wrong. And we have to tell everyone, whether it's on the second floor, it's on the floor of the legislature, or it's any place else. We have to say, you're wrong, and you have to correct it. And you need to go in today, because it is life and death. It's not just life and death for those that went before us. It's life and death for the next cop that rolls up on that job with that idiot over living in Brooklyn, living free, having his party, having his attorneys. You know, what if he has a bad day and he kills one of us again? How many times have you read the headlines of a violent crime, and somewhere in your reporting, the line is there, he was out on parole? Let's take that line out and not let that happen. How many times for a day or two we're going to be outraged that this moke was out on parole and look what happened? I have some gray hair. I've seen it time and time again. Let's stop that loophole, and we have to stop it with police officers. And the changes we're talking about, the violent crimes, it doesn't just affect our families and our police officers, it affects you too. It can affect you if you're violently attacked on the way to the subway, if you're violently attacked in your workplace. It'll help every last one of us. But we are a symbol of what we believe. We're a symbol of what this city's about. So if you're not helping us, they're not helping anyone. So we need to say you're wrong.
Really quick follow-up.
Yes, sir.
Are you working with any other organizations outside of New York City?
We're working with police organizations across the country, National Association of Police Organizations, other individual police groups right here in the area and across the country. Many of the things that we've done is when we put the Keep Cop Killers in Prison, across the country, other organizations are doing the same so they can educate their communities to support their police as well. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate you taking the time on this very moist day to come here and cover this so important story. More importantly, I want to thank the families here that traveled from far and near to be here, to take that pledge of police officers when we say we'll back you up. And the 1013 comes, police officers respond. Well, it was a 1013, you know what? Their wives responded as well. Their sons responded as well. Our widowers responded as well. So I want to thank them for being here with us, because the words, when I say it, I can empathize, but you all lived it. So it means an awful lot more. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate the time.
Thank you.